Hello, this is a brief tutorial on a basic lighting setup in 3D Studio Max. In this scene I have several lights set up and will show some different combinations and some different ideas behind a 3-point light setup on a simple scene. Currently there is one light active with shadows, and of course there's a big difference between having shadows and not having shadows. So I've just turned this off and we'll move the light lister out of screen, and as you can see everything's floating. So shadows are really a very essential part of a light setup, and at least one light should be casting shadows. Under Tools, Light Lister, you can get a list of all lights in your scene, and it's wise to name them appropriately. So we have one spotlight that acts as our key light. We don't quite have full intensity at 1, brought it down a little bit. I've also brought up the map size from the default of 512 and decreased the bias so the shadows that are cast from objects are closer to those objects. So if you ever see a gap between the shadow and the shadow casting object, decrease your bias. And if you add lights, you can always refresh the lister. So when I render this again, you'll see that I now have shadows in the scene. The scene is set up with a camera pointing at my objects, and the spotlight casting shadows is at a close to a 90-degree angle from the camera. One thing that students do commonly is to have the shadow casting light kind of behind the camera, which creates an interesting effect. Of course, we're not to be rendering the top view, but it looks more like we have a headlight, headlamp, flashlight kind of effect. So it's usually better to have the light more at an angle. Another light that we use is a fill light, and in the general parameters under all the lights you can turn them off and on just like you can in the light lister. So this will add a very, very subtle amount of faked reflected light, and I'm not going to turn on shadows for this. I'm going to right click the viewport for which I want to render, and you can see there's just a very soft amount of light simulating the environment light. One thing to mention is under rendering environment, I have brought the background color from the default of black to a gray, to a very dark gray, so I can see the background a little bit better. Alright, now we're going to use the light lister. If I hit refresh, you should see Omni Fill come on. I'm going to turn on Omni Back, and this is a backlight or a rim light, and I'll render that again, and now you can see a little bit of rim light, which makes for an interesting effect. The other light that is set up in the scene, let's go back to the default of the spotlight so you can see that. The other light is a skylight that simulates ambient light, and it does a decent job at simulating the ambient occlusion in the scene. So with that on, you'll notice a significant increase in rendering time, but also a significant increase in the look and the feel of the scene. Everything has a sort of a soft shadow effect coupled with the sharp shadow of the spotlight. And this takes substantially longer, as opposed to just a second or two. That took almost 30 seconds. Now I will turn on all the lights and render that. I will also pause. Okay, that also took about 30 seconds, and this is with all 4 lights on. So let's review what we have. We have a spotlight casting shadows, with a 2K map size using a shadow map type of shadow. Shadows are on. The Omni Fill uses a very light amount of light, just a very small amount. And the Omni Back is at full intensity, high above and behind the scene. The skylight has a 0.5 multiplier. So now I want to show where the lights are positioned. The Omni light is off to the side, but also up. So it simulates the sky light, not the skylight object, but the faked simulated light from the atmosphere, environment, or the sky. The Omni Back is behind the scene, so I've tried to get a good angle between the camera facing the scene and how the Omni Back would glance the light off of the objects to the camera. The skylight is positioned wherever you want it. It does not matter where that goes. And don't forget that the spotlight can be positioned and manipulated from the spotlight view. Shift 4, the $ is the hotkey to be able to move and adjust your spotlight parameters. And a couple final notes. We're going to turn off everything but the key light, the spotlight. Let's make sure we render the correct view that we are using. This is just the spotlight. Some things to note about the spotlight is by default the density of the shadow is 1 and the color of the shadow is dark black. It is full 000 black. So consider taking this off of black and potentially having a contrasting color of the shadows to the light. So if I were to do a warm colored light, I might want to do the opposite color shadow. And again, this is very, very, very subtle. Let's turn that off from black and make a very, very dark purplish tone. I'm going to do a density of 0.8, and I'm also going to change the color of the light to more of an orangey color. So many options exist for lights. It's very important to take your time with it. Start out with a very basic light setup with one shadow casting light positioned well, and then experiment one parameter at a time, adding one light at a time. And for still shots, consider a 2-point or 3-point light setup, and also experiment with the skylight. There are many more details to these lights, and we're going to keep this a brief tutorial. So have fun with it, and remember that it takes a lot of trial and error, a lot of time to get the light just like you want it and to get the right effect.